It started like any normal weekday morning. The sun had barely crept over the ridge when I heard my front doorbell ring. Twice. I ignored it. It was too early for casual visitors, and I figured it was just a delivery. I got up, made some coffee, and wandered out onto my front porch. That's when I saw her. Karen. Standing in my driveway, leaning into the driver's side door of my F-150, with a wire hanger in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other. My stomach dropped and then twisted into a knot of disbelief and anger. She was trying to unlock my truck. Now I'm not just your average homeowner. I'm the police chief for our town, and I've seen a lot in my time. But catching a member of the HOA, let alone the president, attempting to break into my vehicle was a first. I stepped off the porch and approached, calm but firm. "Karen," I called out, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" She flinched, dropped the hanger like it was a live wire, and turned around. "Oh, I thought maybe someone was locked out of their car." "I was just trying to help," she said, voice laced with artificial sweetness. "Someone?" I asked, walking right up to her. "Karen, that's my truck, on my driveway, in front of my house. Who exactly do you think owns it?" She blinked. "Well, it was parked at an angle," she offered weakly, "and it looked suspicious. I thought it might have been abandoned. It's an eyesore, you know. The HOA has rules about that." Suspicious, abandoned. That truck was my daily driver, clean and well kept. She wasn't just being nosy, she was trying to make a point, one rooted in control, and now she'd crossed a line. Tampering with someone's vehicle isn't just poor judgment. It's a crime. I glanced up. My home security camera had her in full view, every movement recorded. My face didn't change, but I felt a sense of satisfaction settle in. "Karen, do you realize what you're doing is illegal?" I said, voice calm and even. "This isn't just a community issue. This is criminal tampering, and you're lucky I saw it before you did any damage." For the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. Her usual smug confidence flickered. "Well, if I had known it was yours." "Doesn't matter who owns it," I cut in. "You can't go around sticking wires into trucks just because you think they're parked wrong. You're not law enforcement, you're not a locksmith, and you're not above the law." I asked her, formally, to leave the property. She mumbled something under her breath about reporting me to the HOA and stormed off. As I stood in the driveway, I realized this was bigger than one incident. Karen had a history of crossing boundaries, and this time she'd gone too far. She thought being head of the HOA gave her authority over the entire block, including my truck. What she didn't know is that she'd just messed with the wrong person, the police chief. And now it was time to show her and the HOA that enough was enough. The very next day, I received an envelope on my doorstep. No postage, no return address, just "for review by homeowner," scribbled in overly neat cursive. Inside, a printed letter on HOA letterhead with Karen's signature at the bottom. It read like a formal notice, but the contents were so absurd I had to sit down. "Due to continued concerns regarding the appearance and orientation of your vehicle, and in accordance with HOA aesthetic guidelines, we reserve the right to intervene when vehicles appear to be improperly stored or parked. As this vehicle has not been moved for 36 hours and was angled beyond our specified alignment tolerances, corrective measures were considered necessary." Corrective measures? She was calling breaking into my locked truck a corrective measure? But what really made my blood pressure spike was the last paragraph. "All homes and vehicles located within the HOA's boundaries are subject to community standards, and in certain cases may be interpreted as shared property under the authority of the board." Shared property. She actually tried to argue that my personal truck was, in some bureaucratic fever dream, shared, Because it was parked in my driveway within HOA boundaries. I've read a lot of legal jargon in my years as police chief, but I'd never seen anything stretch that far from reality. It was clear Karen was testing how far she could bend the rules or invent new ones to get her way. I brought the letter to the next HOA board meeting. Now, those meetings are usually tame. Some lawn complaints, a dispute over mailbox paint, the occasional firework ban. But that night, I walked in with the letter in one hand and a printed image from my security camera in the other. Karen mid-break-in, wire hanger clearly visible, body leaning into the truck window. The room went silent as I stood at the front. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, keeping my voice even, "this is not a hypothetical situation. This is an actual incident that took place on my private property. And this," I held up the letter, "is an attempt to justify it after the fact using language that is both legally baseless and deeply troubling." Karen sat stiffly at the table, her expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. A few board members exchanged awkward glances. One even leaned back in his chair, clearly regretting showing up. "I'm not here tonight as the police chief," I said. "I'm here as a homeowner who expects the same respect and protection that every resident here deserves. What happened was not just an overreach. It was illegal. And if it happens again, I will treat it as such." One board member, Marla, a retired attorney, spoke up. "Karen, did you really attempt to access his truck?" Karen stammered. "I thought it was abandoned, and we have rules about disorderly parking." "This is Texas," Marla said flatly, "not North Korea." Laughter rippled through the room, but the point was made. Karen's attempt to spin her actions into community protection wasn't flying anymore. The board, now visibly uncomfortable, motioned to formally remove the letter from any active file and promised to review procedural overreach in upcoming meetings. I walked out, knowing the tide had started to turn. She wasn't invincible anymore. Still, the fact that she could even attempt to justify trying to unlock someone else's truck as community business told me something crucial. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. By now, I knew Karen wasn't just bold, she was reckless. But what she hadn't considered in her rush to control everything from lawn colors to pickup trucks was that my property is fully secured and monitored. I have a network of high-definition security cameras around my ranch house, not because I fear crime, but because I value evidence. You don't become police chief without learning that the difference between an argument and an arrest often comes down to one thing: proof. So, after that ridiculous letter and the HOA meeting, I queued up the footage from that morning when she was caught red-handed trying to pop open the lock on my truck like she was starring in a bad TV crime drama. The audio picked up just enough to catch her muttering something about community standards as she struggled with the hanger. Better still, the footage included the moment she saw me, froze, and then tried to come up with an excuse. It was all there: the approach, the attempted break-in, the moment she dropped the hanger and spun a lie. I clipped the footage, time-stamped it, and added a copy of the HOA's shared property letter as context. Then I compiled everything into a brief case file and shared it with two key people: the HOA's legal advisor and the city attorney. Not as a threat, but as a professional courtesy. Later that week, I received a call from the HOA's legal counsel, Mr. Levinson, a man who normally avoids conflict like it's contagious. This time, his tone was more serious than usual. "Chief, we received your documentation," he began. "I want to be very clear that the HOA does not condone individual board members entering private property, let alone attempting to access private vehicles. We'll be addressing this directly." Translation: Karen was finally in trouble. The following board meeting saw a noticeable shift. Karen was quieter. Defensive, yes, but no longer untouchable. Levinson made a brief appearance to remind the board of their fiduciary and legal responsibilities, which is lawyer speak for stop breaking the law before someone sues. Then something surprising happened. Other residents started showing up with their own complaints. A neighbor down the street claimed Karen had once peered into his garage. Another said she was fined for non-compliant window tint, a non-existent rule. The security footage had become more than just my defense. It had exposed a pattern. Karen had operated under the assumption that no one would push back hard enough or had the evidence to stop her. But once that footage circulated, her credibility started to unravel. She tried to paint me as aggressive in HOA emails, saying she felt intimidated by my presence and my job title. But that too fell flat. People had seen the footage. They'd seen her actions. The facts spoke louder than her narrative. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to threaten. I had the truth and the footage to back it up. This chapter marked a turning point. When Karen lost control of the story and the community began to realize they were no longer under the thumb of unchecked HOA authority. All it took was a camera, the law, and someone who knew how to use both. Karen's antics had crossed plenty of lines already, but what truly shocked me, and many in the community, was just how deeply she believed in her own authority. To her, HOA rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons, and she had appointed herself as judge, jury, and enforcer. Let's be clear. HOA boards are formed to protect the neighborhood's collective interests, to maintain common areas, uphold agreed-upon standards, and resolve disputes fairly. But Karen had twisted that mission into something personal. She wasn't enforcing the rules. She was making them up as she went along. And once the footage of her trying to break into my truck made the rounds, people started speaking up. One neighbor, Alan, revealed that Karen had threatened to fine him for leaving a kayak in his side yard. Another, Maria, said Karen entered her backyard to inspect a drainage issue without permission and without notifying anyone. That's not management, that's trespassing. Karen's defense? I'm just doing my job. The thing is, her job has limits. HOA board members are not sworn law enforcement officers. They can't investigate, search, or access private property without consent. They have to follow the same laws as everyone else. But Karen saw her position as a blank check. She used the HOA as a personal shield. I'm just enforcing the rules, she'd say, even when there was no rule, no complaint, and no authority to act. This behavior wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about control. In law enforcement, we're trained to recognize patterns of behavior, and Karen's was classic overreach. One incident may seem like a misunderstanding. 2 could be coincidence. But 5, that's a pattern. At the next HOA meeting, I spoke calmly and clearly. What we're seeing is not leadership, it's entitlement. The role of an HOA is to serve, not rule, and no one, no matter their title, is above the law. A few people clapped, others sat quietly. Karen, however, was visibly rattled. For the first time, she didn't interrupt, didn't argue. She just sat with her arms folded, tapping a pen nervously against the table. That meeting ended with a unanimous vote to review all HOA enforcement actions from the last 6 months. A committee was formed, one that didn't include Karen. The message was clear. Her authority had limits, and she had blown past them. In this chapter, the focus shifted from a single outrageous act to a deeper, more dangerous trend. How quickly power can go to someone's head when there's no accountability. Karen mistook her HOA title for a badge, but now she was learning the hard way. Only one of us was the real law on this street. After the security footage and my public statement, the neighborhood's mood shifted noticeably. For the first time in a long time, residents weren't whispering behind closed doors about Karen's behavior. They were openly calling it out. It was time to do more than talk. So I filed a formal complaint to the HOA board. Not a rant, not an email chain. A documented, fully referenced grievance, complete with timestamps, video stills, and witness statements from the neighbors Karen had also harassed. It wasn't just about my truck anymore. It was about misconduct and abuse of authority. Per HOA bylaws, a special hearing was required. The board reluctantly scheduled it, and this time they had no choice but to treat it seriously. The room was packed. Not just board members, but at least 30 homeowners showed up. Normally, these meetings barely drew 5. Karen looked different this time. Not smug, not defensive, just exposed. I stood up and presented my case like I would any internal disciplinary hearing. No emotion, just facts. Footage of Karen trying to access my locked truck without permission. The falsified letter implying my vehicle was community property. Testimony from 3 neighbors about her unauthorized inspections and threats of bogus fines. Evidence that no official HOA policy justified any of her actions. Then I presented the kicker, a copy of the city's municipal code outlining criminal tampering and trespassing statutes, and how Karen's actions were dangerously close to both. The room was dead silent. I concluded, this isn't personal, it's procedural. If any other resident had done this, they'd face real consequences. The board cannot look the other way just because the offender happens to be one of you. One board member, Mr. Patel, someone who had previously sided with Karen on multiple issues, finally spoke up. We can't ignore this. We've let this go on too long. Another, a younger woman named Shannon, added, this is not what we signed up for when we joined the board. We're not here to enable this kind of behavior. A motion was proposed to censure Karen and strip her of her enforcement privileges, pending a full audit of past violations she had issued. The vote passed 6-1. Only Karen voted no. While she technically remained a board member, she no longer had the authority to issue citations, fines, or conduct property inspections. In other words, her power, the thing she wielded like a weapon, had been taken away. Outside the meeting room, neighbors shook my hand, slapped me on the back, and thanked me. Some joked that they should have elected me as HOA president. I told them I already had a full-time job, keeping the actual law intact. The important part was this: the community saw justice being served, fairly, publicly, without bias. This chapter was a milestone, the first real moment of accountability after years of unchecked HOA abuse. And while it didn't fix everything overnight, it proved that no one, not even a self-appointed HOA queen, is above the rules. Especially not when the police chief lives 2 houses down. Even after Karen was censured and stripped of her enforcement authority, her ego didn't deflate easily. Most people would have taken the hint, stepped back, and tried to rebuild trust. But not Karen. Instead, she doubled down, in the most intrusive way possible. About a week after the board vote, I noticed something odd. My motion sensor lights around the side of the house had triggered late at night, 2 nights in a row. I reviewed the security footage, and what I saw was infuriating. Karen walking slowly past the side of my property with a flashlight, stopping near my garage and writing something in a notepad. She wasn't just taking a stroll. She was looking for something. Anything. Some imagined violation. She didn't try to unlock the truck again, not after the fallout from last time. But this felt worse in a way. More deliberate, more creepy. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was snooping. Quietly, and she didn't even try to hide it. I checked my side garage door the next morning. There were subtle scratch marks near the handle. I couldn't prove she tried to open it, but it was suspicious. Combine that with the flashlight incident, and it was starting to feel like we were well past HOA business and into stalker territory. That was when I contacted our local prosecutor, not to file charges yet, but to put the issue on the radar officially. As police chief, I knew better than to handle this like a personal vendetta. I wanted it documented, and I wanted the right people watching closely. The prosecutor advised me to issue a formal cease and desist letter through a neutral third party. I had it drafted and served through my attorney. The document cited trespassing concerns, outlined previous behavior, and made it clear any future intrusion would be treated as criminal. You'd think that would have scared her straight. But no. Instead, Karen posted a thinly veiled community update on the HOA message board the next day, accusing certain residents of weaponizing their positions to silence the board's duties. It was laughable, especially since she had already been stripped of any official duties. But what it did was confirm something important. She didn't think she'd crossed a line. She still believed she was right. Let me be clear. There's a difference between authority and obsession. Karen had blurred that line to the point of no return. This chapter marked the moment where her HOA crusade turned into personal harassment, and how I had to switch hats from homeowner to police chief, with a badge and a legal trail to shut it down. She thought she could intimidate her neighbors into silence. She still didn't realize she picked the wrong driveway to trespass on. Karen's latest stunt had pushed the boundaries from aggressive micromanagement into something more dangerous: unlawful surveillance and intimidation. After serving her the cease and desist, I decided it was time to make things unmistakably clear, both for her and the rest of the board. Not with a threat, not with anger, with the law. I invited the HOA board and any interested residents to attend an open Q&A session I hosted at City Hall. I framed it as a community rights and responsibilities seminar. Neutral, professional, educational. But let's not kid ourselves. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly why we were holding it. The room was packed. I opened with a slideshow walking through some basic legal principles. Property rights, what an HOA can and can't regulate. Trespassing laws, and what constitutes unlawful entry. Vehicle tampering statutes, with clear penalties attached. And finally, surveillance, harassment, and stalking definitions under our state law. Each section featured real case examples, anonymized but painfully close to Karen's behavior. I watched her in the second row, arms crossed, a forced smile twitching on her lips as I cited one statute after another. At the end, I fielded questions. Some were genuine, neighbors asking how to protect their rights or understand HOA fines. Others came from board members, suddenly curious about where their responsibilities ended. Karen didn't speak, not during the session. But after, she approached me. Alone. Her voice had lost that edge. "You know," she began, "you didn't have to embarrass me." I looked at her squarely. "Karen, I didn't mention your name. I didn't need to. Your actions did that on their own." She tried to brush it off. "You could have come to me privately." "I did," I said, "when you were caught trying to break into my truck, and again when you walked around my garage in the middle of the night. You didn't listen then, so now I'm doing it publicly, by the book." She stared for a long moment. "I was just trying to keep order in the neighborhood." "No," I said, steady. "You were trying to control it. There's a difference, and now the neighborhood sees it." That was the end of the conversation. I didn't need her to admit guilt. I didn't need a fake apology. The point had been made, legally, publicly, and with total clarity. That Q&A night became a turning point in the community. People began attending meetings again. Residents asked more questions. challenged arbitrary rules, and reminded the board that the HOA wasn't a monarchy. It was a service. Karen faded into the background after that, still technically on the board, but no longer the face of it. This chapter wasn't about punishment. It was about education, showing people the power of the law when it's used correctly, not abused. Karen didn't want to hear it, but she heard it anyway. After the seminar at City Hall, a ripple went through the community. Not a wave of drama, but something much more important: awareness. For the first time in years, residents who had once avoided HOA meetings started showing up again. People who had quietly paid unjust fines or ignored passive-aggressive letters from Karen now realized they hadn't been alone. And more importantly, they hadn't been wrong. The feedback was immediate. Neighbors I barely knew knocked on my door to thank me. Others left notes or sent messages through our neighborhood app. Finally, someone stood up to her. I thought it was just me she harassed. Now I know it was all of us. Never thought I'd be relieved to have the police chief living next door. There was, of course, backlash too, mainly from Karen's inner circle. A small but loud group of residents who had benefited from her favoritism and didn't like seeing their influence slip. They accused me of using my position unfairly, even though every action I'd taken was through the proper channels. I wasn't writing tickets or making arrests. I was protecting my rights and standing up for my neighbors. The irony: most of Karen's supporters were silent when it really counted. When the evidence came out, the security footage, the trespass notes, the false citations, not one of them spoke up in her defense during the official meetings. They vanished into the background. That's the thing about bullies. They rarely stand alone. But once the spotlight shines, they scatter. The neighborhood itself began to change in small but noticeable ways. The HOA board started sending clearer notices, with proper citations and actual rule references. Residents started recording board meetings, and minutes were finally published publicly. A new committee was formed to review old citations, including several that were quietly reversed or voided. Even the tone of neighborhood conversations changed. Instead of tension and whispered complaints, people laughed again. Barbecues returned. Parents started meeting by the lake. People reclaimed the space they had come to avoid out of fear of HOA interference. Karen? She still lived 2 streets down, still a board member, technically, but she didn't walk the neighborhood like she used to. Her clipboard was gone. Her stare no longer lingered on trash cans or front lawns. She had lost more than just her authority. She'd lost her credibility, and that's something no title can restore. This chapter wasn't just about me. It was about what happens when one person stands up, and others realize they can too. It reminded everyone that power, no matter where it comes from, must be earned and kept in check. Otherwise, it becomes something else entirely. As much as Karen tried to retreat into silence, the formal complaint process wasn't over, not by a long shot. While the HOA board had already censured her and stripped her of enforcement duties, there was still the issue of liability. When someone in a position of perceived authority crosses the line into illegal behavior, especially when it involves trespassing, attempted tampering, and misuse of community power, the consequences don't just stop at a boardroom vote. The city attorney's office followed up with a written statement confirming that Karen's actions, particularly the attempt to unlock my truck, met the threshold for criminal tampering. They stopped short of pursuing charges, but only because I hadn't pressed them. For now, I wanted the community to resolve it internally. But the warning was crystal clear. Any further incident involving similar behavior will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Karen was also ordered to attend a mandatory mediation session with the HOA's Oversight Committee. This wasn't some feel-good chat. This was a formal step toward ensuring her continued presence on the board didn't open the HOA up to legal exposure. I didn't attend the session, but I got the summary afterward. Karen refused to accept personal wrongdoing. She blamed miscommunication and community confusion. She agreed, reluctantly, to cease all formal or informal enforcement activity, including making comments to neighbors about violations. That might sound like a minor slap on the wrist, but for someone like Karen, whose entire identity was wrapped up in the control she wielded, it was devastating. But here's where the story turned even more interesting. The HOA's insurance carrier caught wind of the complaints and investigation. They opened a risk assessment to determine whether Karen's behavior had exposed the HOA to lawsuits. Their conclusion? Yes. They issued a notice. If the board didn't take additional action to limit her role or remove her from the board entirely, the HOA's coverage could be adjusted, meaning higher rates or worse, loss of coverage. That was the nail in the coffin. The board held one final special meeting, and this time the vote wasn't just about enforcement authority. It was about removal. Karen tried to defend herself. She claimed the footage was taken out of context, that I had manipulated the community with my badge. But the board had seen enough. So had the neighborhood. The vote to remove her from the HOA board passed 7-0. She stormed out halfway through the motion. Didn't even stay to hear the final tally. The next week, a new HOA chair was elected, a local high school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 10 years and never once handed out a fine. Peace, for once, settled back over our streets. This chapter was about justice, not dramatic, not vengeful, but measured and official. It showed that even when someone with a little power goes too far, systems can work. You just have to push them into motion, with evidence, patience, and persistence. By the time Karen was officially removed from the HOA board, things around the neighborhood had changed. Not just administratively, but culturally. The fear that had quietly gripped residents for years had finally loosened its grip. Neighbors talked more freely. Property inspections became rare and legitimate. And that lakefront ranch of mine? It finally felt like home again. But this whole experience taught me a lot more than I expected, not just about one overreaching HOA member, but about power, responsibility, and knowing your rights. Here's what I learned. 1. Bullies don't stop until you make them. Karen never asked permission, never questioned whether her actions were justified. She acted because no one had stopped her. Until now. It reminded me of something I've seen too often in law enforcement. People who exploit authority aren't always loud about it. Sometimes they wrap it in policy, in fine print, in fake professionalism. The only real antidote to that kind of behavior is accountability. And when you've got the law on your side, you're not being difficult, you're being prepared. 2. The badge isn't just for work. When Karen started targeting me, she didn't know I was the police chief. And honestly, that made her mistake more revealing. She didn't think twice about crossing the line because she had done it to others before, people she thought wouldn't fight back. The badge I wear isn't a weapon. It's a promise to protect and serve no matter where I am. Whether I'm on duty or grilling ribs on my back porch, I still uphold the same values. Respect the law, defend the defenseless, and expose the ones who abuse power. She found that out the hard way. 3. Know your rights, or someone will use them against you. HOAs can be a good thing when they stick to their charter, but left unchecked, they can grow into something toxic. Karen wasn't the HOA. She hijacked it. She weaponized rules that didn't exist and created authority that wasn't real. And because people didn't know their rights, she got away with it. For years. until someone stood up and said, "Show me where it says you can do that." In a world full of Karens, the question is your greatest weapon. 4. Community is stronger than control. The most satisfying part of this whole saga wasn't the vote to remove her or the cease and desist order. It was watching neighbors who had been isolated by fear start to come together again. People shook hands, swapped stories, shared their own run-ins, and stood up for each other. Control divides, community unites. Once people realized they weren't alone, Karen never stood a chance. As for me, life's back to normal. I park my truck wherever I please. I built a new fence, this time with a barbecue smoker attached, and I leave my garage door open without worrying about someone trying to inspect it with a clipboard and a fake smile. I never set out to start a rebellion. I just wanted to live in peace. But if there's one thing I've learned after all these years, both as a police chief and as a neighbor, it's this. Never let someone else tell you what your rights are. Know them, stand by them, and if necessary, defend them. Because sometimes the people enforcing the rules are the ones breaking them the most. And sometimes all it takes to stop them is a camera, a calm voice, and a little bad-shaped reminder. You picked the wrong guy.